Well, it's good to talk to you again, and I want to follow up yesterday on some of the things Heather was talking about. It's amazing as we continue to move through Nehemiah how a lot of this kind of flows right on through. But as we get into chapter 8 here and finish it up, the people are actually celebrating the Festival of Booths, otherwise known as Succoth. And I remember way back when we were in Leviticus, how Heather had pictures from Israel of what that looked like. And this just reminded me of way back when we started doing this blog. That must have probably been back in March or so by my account. So it was kind of a little nostalgic here as we were well into the year. But at the same time, what I found interesting is the same thing Heather mentioned yesterday, and that is how the people did this command of God and celebrated this festival with great joy. And it wasn't something they did grudgingly, but rather with great joy. And it reminded me of about 8 years ago when I tore my ACL, and it took 9 months to get back to the point where I walked back on the soccer field. And I still remember that night going back out there and just being thrilled to get back on the field and play. It didn't matter how I played, just so that I could be out there again. And I get the feeling that for the people here, just being able to be back in Jerusalem and to be able to worship their God as God had commanded them must have given them great joy. So we get this wonderful celebration, and then we move into chapter 9, which is this long confession. And I'm showing my age now, but I remember an old TV show called To Tell the Truth. And in this TV show, there were 3 people who would stand up front, and they would all claim to be the same person. And the MC would describe who this person was, maybe something unusual about them, and then the 3 people who were the contestants would begin to ask questions, trying to figure out who was the real person. And of course, at the end, they would ask the real person to stand up after the contestants had tried to guess who it was. And that's really what the Hebrew word for confession here is all about. It's to tell the truth. However, it's not just to tell the truth and confess one's sins, but it might be to tell the truth about someone else, or it might be to tell the truth about God himself. And in fact, the editor of Ezra Nehemiah here, when this is put together, takes chapter 9 and compiles this long confession into one single unit. And weaved into that is a confession of the people's sin, but also a confession about who and how great God is, and about his forbearance and his love and his compassion and his grace for his people. And in fact, what happens is this becomes really more of a confession of sin here. It really becomes a celebration of who God is. And if you read through this, you get to the end and you say, oh, well, yeah, it was a confession, but it wasn't just the people confessing their sins. That was more of a supporting role. The real star of that confession was God and all of his actions, because it was a detailed account of history and God's interaction in the lives of his people. So yes, it was a confession. The people confessed their sin. They didn't rationalize. They didn't try to diminish it. But nonetheless, it really was more of a starring role for God and who he is and what he was about. And of course, we get into chapter 10, and we get this kind of renewal of vows. It was almost like a couple saying "I do" all over again some years down the road. And you could see how this would happen. It's certainly God's people. They are certainly in Jerusalem, but this is a very different time after having been in the exile, and Jerusalem and Judah look nothing like they did at one time. And so the people were renewing their commitment to God and having to figure out how is that going to play out in the midst of a very different time and situation. And I think that really spoke to me in terms of how we must do the same thing. God's word is timeless. His plans, his commands are timeless. And yet we live in a very different time than the people of Judah at that time. In fact, I would submit the changes in our world are moving at a much more rapid rate. We live in a very different time than even 20, 30 years ago. And I think it's important for us as individuals and for us as the church to acknowledge that and to work hard, because it's not easy, to apply God's timeless truths and teachings to a very quickly changing world. And now, there are those who would attempt to shrink back from that, build up a wall, sit behind it, not change it all, and pray that Jesus would come again soon. But that is not what God's call on our lives says. He says, go and make disciples, seek and save the lost, and those are the things we are to be about. And so we must be out in the world. But how do we do that and remain faithful to God and His truths in our lives? And that requires of us, as Heather pointed out yesterday, constant learning, constant listening, constant applying and challenging in order to make sure that we are faithful. And remembering that when we fail, and we will fail, that we come back to God, acknowledge that, and go forward. And I thought about this in terms of one final caution here, and that is that when we renew our commitment to God, and we can do that and we should do that regularly. We do that in our worship every week. It's that same I do. Lord, thank you. Forgive my sin and allow me and work in me to follow you ever more closely. But we should never do it as if we're trying to earn God's favor at that point, which is a natural inclination, is to start over and say, okay, now I'm not going to do it, and God's going to be happier with me because of all the good things I'm going to do. The truth is, we struggle daily in our sin, but it doesn't negate the fact that God is working in us and through us to accomplish His purposes, and therefore we go out in the world, and we go out with hope and with joy, living as God has commanded us, and applying those commands in a rapidly changing world, because they do give us a firm foundation upon which to stand. We'll find out in the New Testament that it's like building on the solid rock rather than building on the shifting sands. And so, note today then, as the people of God here recommitted themselves, that might be a good thing for me to do today, is go to the Lord and rededicate myself to Him, confessing my sin, acknowledging His grace and His wonder and His love, and then going forward and celebrating as He would have me do. And so I pray that in your life today as well, and we'll look forward to talking with you again.